Today, I'm going to challenge your opinion about fluency. And what you think fluency is probably far from reality. When you think about fluency, you probably make assumptions like, fluency is about being able to be understood perfectly by everyone. Being able to speak and write clearly, read books, watch movies, and listen to music just like a native would. So you dive hard into language learning, focusing on textbooks, tutors, building your vocabulary, memorizing grammar, and you do everything that you can to be fluent. But then you fall into the trap of missing out on the most important thing, in my opinion, when it comes to building fluency. Now, before we get into exactly what that is, I want to say that technical fluency, your ability to read and write and speak and listen, is still really important, but it's not the whole picture. Yes, obviously you do need to learn the language. You need to learn to listen, to speak, to write, and to read with a high accuracy. But there is actually a lot more to knowing a language than just being able to listen and speak and write and read it. Because there can be a variety of ways to express the same thought, but how you choose to express it will show to native speakers of that language whether you really know the language or you just know how to use the language. And there is a difference between the two. On a deeper level, the words and expressions that we're using to express ourselves are secondary to our thoughts and feelings. That is to say that whatever language we speak, we all have, the same feelings. We're the same people. We're capable of the same thoughts. But the tools that we have to express those thoughts are shaped by the language that we're using and the cultural context that we're in. Now, there's this myth out there that when we speak another language that we develop another personality. But the reality is that we all just have one personality. It's just that when you speak another language, you're not just using another language, you're also operating from a very different cultural context. So your way of thinking and your behavior will start to change to reflect the culture and the cultural context that you're operating in. Because we all live in different cultures, we all have very different values and expectations about behavior and politeness. Languages essentially evolve around our needs. If there's something that we really need to talk about, we'll create words and expressions to talk about it. And because different cultures value different things, naturally the language has evolved to represent those differences. So imagine people in the same situation, all around the world, the same problem or the same conflict. Their approach to talking about it and addressing it and the way they use their language in that situation is all going to vary. Language is just a tool that we use to communicate. And our culture, our customs, our values, our beliefs, they just shape how we use that tool. Now, obviously, in many instances, a lot of the differences that we experience in communication is going to come down to our personality. But in many instances, when using a foreign language, it can immediately reflect your lack of cultural fluency. And what matters more than you might realize is cultural fluency. It's not about just thinking about what you want to say in English and then translating that to another language. Because people around the world are going to think about the same situation differently. And thus they will approach the language and use the language in a very different way to express themselves. So I would argue that it's not enough to know the language, just technically speaking, but to also understand in what ways people would actually use it. Now, I thought really hard about what examples I could give you guys, and unfortunately it's really hard for me to think of specifics just because these are things that I don't really notice unless I'm in the moment clocking it as it happens. Like, oh, hey, this is something I wouldn't really use in English. But I know from my experience living in Korea, particularly when I'm speaking Korean, that I feel I often communicate in ways that I just would not communicate in English. I'm using a lot of expressions. I'm putting ideas together in very different ways. And that's all really influenced by what's considered polite in Korea and what's considered rude. And a lot of that is very different from English. So for example, like in Korea, if I were to just translate from English, what would be happening is actually I would be translating American cultural context. I would be thinking in my American cultural context about what I want to say or communicate and how I would do that in America. Because when I'm speaking English, I'm an American, and so there's a bit of American context there. So I would be basically taking the way that I would behave in America and in English and then just putting that into Korean. And then that would create a lot of weird expressions and honestly a lot of rude expressions, I can imagine too. But the problem is, as much as you think what you're trying to communicate is neutral, you've already gone wrong because you're already thinking with a different cultural context. When I'm thinking in English as an American, it's very American coded. So whatever I'm thinking is the appropriate thing to say and to do in a certain situation in English is reflective of what I have learned is culturally acceptable in America. And if I just translate that into Korean, it does not mean it's going to be culturally acceptable in Korean to communicate that exact same way. You essentially have to acquire the ability to understand that language's cultural context. How would Koreans express this? What are the words and expressions Korean would use? And you kind of have to, like, I'm sorry to say, abandon your culture a little bit to learn that. I'm not saying like you have to truly abandon your culture and throw it away in the trash can and be gone. Just when you're learning to speak language, you do also have to learn a new culture and you have to operate like you are in that culture now. Now, in addition to cultural fluency, you also need some situational, functional fluency built on top. Now, let's say like you know a language really well and you can even read like really intense novels in it. But can you go to the bank in that language and open a banking account? Can you file taxes in that language? Can you call the police and make a police report about being robbed? Can you go to a store and be like, hey, I lost my phone. Did you find a phone here? Can you go through experiences like this in that language? Because a lot of these things, like going to the bank, filing taxes and things like that, they really change country to country. You might not just lack the vocabulary needed to go do something like open a bank account, but you also might lack the cultural understanding of how people make bank accounts. It seems really silly, but growing up, you probably went to the bank at some point with your parents and you watched them have conversations. I think a lot of these more formal things that we do in our life, like going to the store, buying coffee, filing taxes, to some extent we're exposed to our parents going through these more adult life tasks. And we're learning a lot by watching them, that when we grow up, we kind of know what to expect because we saw the processes laid out for us. But in other countries and in other languages, the processes are different and we don't have those same experiences of watching people go through the processes. So unless you take the time to learn what those differences are and to be aware of them, you might not really know what they are or that they even exist. Now, some of you might be wondering, well, is this really important? Because I don't live abroad and I don't have any plans to live abroad and I'm not going to need to open a bank account in this language that I'm learning. And that's fair. But I do feel like in a weird way, your ability to at least have those kinds of conversations in your target language are a really big part of cultural fluency. Now, to some extent, if you choose to visit the country that uses the language you're learning, you probably will have experiences where you order food and you make purchases, interact with like hotel workers and things like that. To some extent, you will experience these. You might not experience like opening a bank account or paying taxes, but I feel like even if you don't need to do those things, if you are able to like act out and actually imitate a conversation of going to the bank or going and filing your taxes and doing all of these things in your target language, I think that actually shows you have high cultural fluency and that you know how to use the language in the way that like native speakers would use it. Because you could be able to read novels in your target language, but not be able to have these basic everyday conversations that are less impressive. But if you're someone who can easily jump into those everyday situations and easily know what to expect, say, and do, you are going to come across more fluent to people than the person who can't do those things but can like read impressive, intense level books. I mean, sometimes I feel like I want to pat myself on the back when I'm like doing something really cool in another language, but I think the reality is that native speakers, people that we're going to communicate with in these languages, they care more about how you communicate in everyday situations more than your ability to like read books and do more academic things. Now, I know my take on this might be kind of controversial for all of you guys. Some of you at this point in the video might be thinking, well, Sarah, this is all nonsense and I don't agree with you one bit. And I just want to say to all those people, well, that's fine. You don't have to. That's okay. The language learning space has a lot of ideas about fluency. This is just my personal view of fluency, and obviously it reflects my values and what's important to me when it comes to learning languages. And if it's not important to you and you kind of want to just skip on this video, that's totally fine and no hard feelings. But if you did find my take kind of resonated with you, or you found it interesting, or something you never considered before and you're wondering, well, Sarah, how does one build cultural fluency? This is the part of the video where I'm going to give you guys some ideas and some tips to do that if you are interested. So let's talk about some of the things that you can do to build cultural fluency. Honestly, the best thing that you can do is to just really work in efforts to understand the culture and how language is used in culture in your speaking practice. I think a lot of it is going to be tied to conversational skills, and especially your word choice when it comes to communicating with people when you talk. Fortunately, in this day and age, there are so many people online teaching their language to people. Like, for example, there are a lot of people I know who make videos in Korean, like, oh, real Korean versus textbook Korean. And you can even find videos of people who create fake dialogues. They act out a scenario like that learners of that language can see how people actually communicate in day-to-day life. Because I think in every language I've ever learned, the book will always teach you like the correct way and the proper way, and there is importance to that, and you do need to know those ways of communicating. But in everyday life, we tend to talk very differently, and it's very important you learn that everyday life style of communicating, because that is like where the cultural fluency is baked in, and that's where you're going to connect with people the most. Another great thing you can do is if you have a language partner or a tutor, you could ask them to role play certain scenarios with you. Like, especially if you plan to visit that country, think about situations you might be in if you were to visit. If this context, there's things that happen that you don't expect to happen, well, they're going to ask questions. They're going to behave in the same way that someone in that country would behave. And through that role play, you're going to start to learn how people interact in this environment. And then you can also kind of just respond to it the way that you think is best, and then get feedback from your language partner, your tutor, what you did wrong, or what would people say that would be more natural. Like, oh, that makes sense, but usually people wouldn't say it that way. They would say this instead. That's the kind of feedback that would really teach you how to operate in that kind of context. Now, I want to say like watching movies and shows can be helpful, but I honestly want to say that when you watch movies and shows to like learn cultural context and how people talk in different situations, I would take it with a grain of salt. Because if you think about it, these things are highly scripted, and it's theatrics, it's entertainment. So a lot of the times the writing is set up to create interesting conflict or exaggerated expressions or poetic expressions, because there could be underlying themes in the content. And I just think about in English, you know, it's very cliche in like TV shows and movies that someone's getting a phone call and they're like in a bad mood and they think that it's this person that they don't like, and they go, "What?" And then they realize it's their boss or someone that they shouldn't be yelling at, and they're like, "Oh," and they're surprised. But, you know, in English, no matter what the context is, I don't think anyone just answers the phone like, "What?" Usually everyone looks at their phone and sees who's calling them and says, "Hello?" TV shows and movies in English don't reflect reality. You can imagine that when you're learning another language, there's a lot of situations where it's an exaggerated form of reality, and you don't know which parts are really true to reality and which parts are the exaggerated parts. So I would highly caution you to take clues from scripted television and film to give you an idea of how people communicate, because you could just come across really rude. So use real people like tutors, language partners, and honestly, I'm gonna say content creators are gonna be much better helpers than actors. But then that's the other thing that I wanted to recommend, is not just like finding videos on social media of like people actually teaching you expressions, but just watching social media content in your target language, because these days, like, Short form videos are full of skits that people do. And by watching skits and different videos, you can start to pick up like how people behave and communicate and talk in different contexts. Just scrolling on your phone and watching videos in your target language can actually serve as a great tool to learn expressions and to learn like situational awareness of how to act in different situations in that language. Now, as I said, I know that some of you watching this video are just not going to agree with me, and you might be thinking, well, cultural fluency is important, but true fluency is really just about language mastery. And that's fine. I think someone who seems really culturally in sync with everyone but makes a lot of mistakes is going to be perceived as more fluent and more relatable than someone who has strong accuracy and precision with the language but communicates and uses expressions in unexpected ways. And at the end of the day, this is just my opinion. You know, you can agree with me, you can disagree with me. Either way is okay. But whatever camp you're in, I'd love to hear your specific thoughts about fluency and what it means to be fluent in a language.